A number of guests duly introduced by fellows beg leave to attend your meeting. Is it your pleasure that I welcome them in your name? Thank you. Before we go on to the formal business this evening, can I welcome members of the Roman Society and the Hellenic Society to this joint meeting. Great pleasure from the Antiquities point of view to work together with other societies, and it's something I hope we're going to do more of. The Hellenic Society and Roman Society are sort of twins and younger offspring, I think, of the Antiquities, well known for their support for multidisciplinary studies in Greek and Roman studies, producing important journals. And there are, for those of you who aren't members and who I'm sure should be encouraged to join, there are some leaflets there, and it's also possible to subscribe separately to Argo, the magazine produced by the Society. So a very warm welcome to you all. I hope you'll bear with us while we do our tradition of several hundred years of business before we move on to the lecture. Minutes.
The minutes of the ordinary meeting, extraordinary meeting of the minutes of the ordinary meeting of the Society of Antiquities London on Thursday, 8th of December 2022 at Burlington House and online. Professor Martin Millett is president in the chair. The minutes of the ordinary meeting and extraordinary general meeting, both of Thursday, 1st of December 2022, were read and signed. The following miscellany of communications were then laid before the Society. A timber castle drawn on stone, a medieval graffito from the castle at Caen by Dr. Edward Impey, FSA, and a cabal of jealous, self-interested men, John Buckler's blackballing at the Society of Antiquaries by Dr. Joshua Mardell. Thanks were returned for these communications. The President announced that the next meeting would be on Thursday, 2nd of February 2023, then adjourned the meeting. A mulled wine reception followed.
Is it your pleasure that I sign these minutes? We now have a deviation from previous practice. Can I remind fellows present that owing to the changes in the nomination and balloting system, we will no longer be reading blue papers, nomination fellowship meetings. The blue papers are now suspended, in inverted commas, online on the fellows platform under the documents tab. You can find there the blue papers and the paper ballot forms for the ballot on the 16th of February. If there are any queries about that, please do let us know. The blue papers for the next ballot, which opens on the 15th of February and closes on the 16th of March. I'm sure we will get used to the new system. Admissions.
The following being in attendance and having signed the obligation required by the statutes desire to be admitted a fellow. Yanis Galanakis.
We now come to the main business of this evening's meeting, which is to hear a paper by Yanis Galanakis. This is all a bit incestuous, I'm afraid. Yanis is a colleague of mine in the Faculty of Classics at Cambridge, where he's Associate Professor of Classics, specialising in the classical art and archaeology, particularly expertise in mortuary archaeology of the Aegean Bronze Age. He's also the director of the archives in the faculty where we hold the Mycenae archive now, and the keeper of silver in his college, Sydney, Sussex, who owns the mace. Among his interests are the antiquities trade in the 19th century Europe, examined through the lens of legal measures taken in the course of the century to control and regulate safeguarding ancient objects. And he's written extensively in the archaeology of Mycenaean Aegean, and he is currently preparing a book, which I think is close to the subject of the lecture this evening, on the mid to late 19th century antiquities trade. Yes.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Is the sound okay? Is it too loud? I will try to speak softly. Welcome everybody, and thank you very much, Martin and the Society, for the invitation and the lovely introduction. It's also great to have this opportunity to finally be admitted, because I was actually elected in 2018, but then 2 kids came to my life, a pandemic and more teaching. So I didn't have the opportunity really from 2018 to be here. It's a great honor. And for me, the first thing I asked Martin is whether this was the room where Heinrich Schliemann in the 1870s first gave his expose of the Trojan discoveries. And indeed, the room had a different setting, but that's the very room. So for me, it resonates all the more to be here on the shoulders of giants that the Society of Antiquaries, of course, had as members, but also to acknowledge how many great papers have been delivered in this room, and they changed the course of archaeology forever. I'm not saying that what you're going to hear necessarily is going to do that, so I shouldn't be raising expectations too much, but it is a great honor to be here. And of course, it's wonderful that this is a joint event in collaboration with the Hellenic and the Roman societies, and members of these societies are here. So that makes it all the more great. So as you have heard, I'm an archaeologist working on the Bronze Age Aegean, and I came to the antiquities trade through my involvement some 15 years ago now in the redevelopment of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. And as I was crossing the road, I thought, okay, the redevelopment happened in 2009, but when actually the Ashmolean in Oxford became the Museum of Classical Art and Archaeology that it is today, it was actually at the end of the 19th century for the first time, with money from Mr. Fortnum, who has Fortnum and Mason just across the road. So, you know, think when you next shop there. I don't think the people of the Ashmolean benefit from that much these days. But in the Ashmolean, there were archives and objects, and I became interested in finding out more about how they ended up there. And I became also really passionate about finding out more about the people who were involved in the procurement, if you like, of these objects. Now, Oxford, of course, doesn't have just one great museum, it has many great museums. And as it happens, I was invited to do a study in the Pitt Rivers Museum. And it is in combination with all this museum work I was doing at the time that my interest in the subject grew. And little did I know back then where it would take me, how multifaceted and demanding it will be, but also how very rewarding. And what happened was that I was cataloging material, because as you know, the Pitt Rivers is mostly an anthropological collection, and they had some Mycenaean antiquities. And I came across, you know, something like the stirrup jar that you see on the slide. It dates to the 12th century. And I was really struck by the fact that it had original labels on it from the seller. And the label reads, from Athens, 1872, March, from the outer Keramaikos, by the orphanage of Hansi Kostas. I also have the skull of the deceased, in case you're interested. This is like a message in a bottle. So I was interested. I think the person who probably bought the stirrup jar was interested. And this led me to contact various institutions, including the Natural History Museum in London, and they were very, very helpful. And they told me, yeah, sure, we have this skull, and at the back it says George Rolleston. And I followed the trail, and that's really what got me into this research. And the trail took me back to Oxford again, to the Natural History Museum, where George Rolleston was a curator, and he was a professor of physiology in the 19th century. And I found a treasure trove. I found the paper trail. And then I found the correspondence between the great doctor and an Athenian antiquities dealer that I will be talking to you later today. And that really paved the way for the systematic research that I later embarked on. So in this presentation, I would like to share my thoughts with you on the subject, present some of the ideas I have, and also open the floor for discussion and debate. Just to borrow from Tennyson, there lives more faith in honest doubt. So please doubt, question, and let's start the debate afterwards. Questions and feedback are most welcome for me. As Martin mentioned, I'm also trying to put all this material together and publish them in a monograph when I find the time, that is. Now, in the past, this topic was either little explored, or if of interest, it was examined through the lens of some exceptionally well-known high-profile cases and in relation to questions of possession and repatriation. There was limited interest, really, in understanding the structure of the trade, the people behind it, and the social histories that can emerge from this material. And if the trade was mentioned at all, it was done as part of general histories of classical archaeology or the Grand Tour and the Dilettanti, with special focus on Italy as opposed to Greece. And don't get me wrong, I mean, the titles that you see on the slide here, they're all excellent and for different reasons. They just don't really treat the topic I'm interested in any great detail. Now, this attitude did start to change about 20 years ago, I would say. And you will see lots of titles now on display. And I believe that my research is part of that change. I mean, I acknowledge the fact. Not only is there now a genuine interest in investigating the provenance of the contextualized objects in modern European and North American museums, again, for all sorts of reasons, but there is also a genuine interest for a more critical historiography of archaeology and the writing of a social history of the antiquities trade. This interest is well reflected in the number of publications that have appeared, especially in the last 10 to 15 years. And you can see here some of them. I mean, clearly this is a selection, it's not an exhaustive presentation of the excellent work that has been produced in this period. So I apologize for any omissions, but I would also like to mention, not least because I'm in this room, the Antiquities Journal that has included over time many important publications on the subject, and of course the Journal of the History of Collections. I would also like to draw your attention to the excellent recent work of a young colleague of Chiara Mannoni of the University of Basilicata in Italy, who has taken a comparative study of legal documents from across the Mediterranean. She has also done an excellent service for us because she has translated all these documents. Some of them are medieval, some of them are from Spain. So having the whole span of this material now in front of our eyes allows for a proper comparative contextualization of the legal documents that are associated with the protection of antiquities. And I think with things in general that we now would classify under the general term antiquities. Okay, so back then they are not exactly distinguishing, they're using all sorts of terms, and this terminology, this vocabulary develops over the centuries. There are now also a lot more publications in the native language, say of Italy and Greece, covering this important topic, publications that make available very important, hitherto little known or explored archival material. And last but not least, there is the emergence of archival archaeology as a dynamic subfield within our subject, a move, I think, encouraged further in England by the management of research projects in the historic environment and various actions of the Museum of London Archaeology, actions that place archives more systematically on the map of archaeological discussion, study, and debate. All in all, we are now, I hope you agree, in a much better position to develop proper methodologies for the study and contextualization of a topic such as the antiquities trade, which obviously relies extensively on objects and archival documents. Despite this interest, however, I still feel that sometimes the way in which this topic is being treated is rather opportunistic. One cherry picks information here and there as they see fit, be it archaeological or historical, than trying to contribute to a holistic, systematic study of this complex topic. Moreover, while there is a bit of a momentum on objects, when it comes to the study of people, we still largely focus on the top players outside the source countries. That is where antiquities were being sourced and traded, and not the local agents and protagonists. Now, while for Italy, there is a notable exception in the exemplary publication of Ilaria Pignamini and Claire Hornsby, And you can see the two books on the slide. An equivalent for Greece in the 19th century is very much a desideratum. And this is exactly one of the aims of my work, which would contribute to the shifting, I hope, of attention from the grand collectors to the local protagonists of the trade, giving back voice to the diggers, the dealers, the agents of the various museums operating in Greece in the period of interest. I'm particularly also interested in the social context, the organization that is of the trade, and the motives of the various actors. I also want to investigate not only how various legal documents came about, but more importantly, I think, to see what impact archaeological/heritage legislation might have had on the relationship people develop with the past, especially as a result of the illicit and licit trade in ancient objects. That is to say, how archaeological legislation frames and shapes behaviors, a point to which I return at the end of my talk. By going back to the protagonists of this fascinating story and by contextualizing them historically and alongside the Antiquities legislation that was in operation in Greece at the time, my hope is to provide a glimpse of a world little known, a social history of the Antiquities trade where people and their actions take center stage and ancient objects become active agents in the promotion, negotiation, and service of different socio-political, economic, and aesthetic agendas. I would like to do this today by introducing you briefly to three characters that I have come to know all too well. There are a lot more, of course, and I would be happy to expand, if you like, on this in the discussion. But I think these three allow us to think on various questions and of the different directions the social history of the Antiquities trade in Greece can take. What I hope to offer, to the extent possible, is the insider's local perspective on the subject. Now, historically, as we all know too well, this is a remarkable period. By the end of the 19th century, Europe has been transformed into something that, on the whole, we still recognize, relate to, and debate about to this day, with all its problems. The Greek case is no exception. Greece is one of the nation states that emerged in the course of the long 19th century, a century that also witnessed the transformation of archaeology from a subject of general antiquarian interest to a field of systematic study of the past. Archaeology and modernity went hand in hand, with museums taking center stage, popularizing new discoveries to a much larger segment now of the population. And with more layers of the human past coming to light, archaeology also became a field of political contestation. Certainly in the case of the Mediterranean, archaeology is following closely the political and economic ambitions of the great powers of the time on the ground, being a sort, if you like, of a cultural branch of their hegemonic or sometimes directly colonial power strategies. Within this context, and from the middle of the 19th century in particular, there was a noticeable increase in demand for antiquities. If you like, here you see on the slide, someone who would have collected, of course, en masse in the middle of the 19th century. This is King Ludwig I of Bavaria. And he's the father, I would like you to keep this information, of Otto, who will become the first king of Greece. And he was a collector. If you now go to Munich, you will see the amazing Greek antiquities collections they have there. But he was also collecting all sorts of things, as the painting clearly suggests. But then you have a shift also because of economic changes, because of travel, because of tourism. A lot more people are in a position now to buy something, have something from the past. And I think this illustration from the Illustrated London News captures that beautifully. I love the caption: diggers searching for antiquities while visitors admire the great tumulus at Marathon. While you visit the site, someone is going to dig up stuff for you, and you can buy them fresh from the ground. So this is really the attitude that I notice, changing significantly from the middle of the 19th century. There is a matter of scale, so a lot more now can be acquired by a lot more people. There are, of course, new museums, as I've already alluded to, economic changes. You have publications becoming eventually cheaper, with more people having access to them. Exhibitions, of course, they are organized more regularly, photography, and all of that. Within this historical setting, then, how were objects sourced and traded? And that's where the three protagonists that I'm going to talk to you about come into the picture. Now, the reason I have some notes is because I want to stick to time. Otherwise, I'm so enthusiastic that I will be talking to you for many hours, and I'm sure you have other things to do after this lecture. But now I will move really more closely to the slides, because the first character is Atanasius Rossopoulos. And Rossopoulos, if you like, he's the new Greek. So he's born in the territory of the Ottoman Empire in northern Greece, in Kastoria. He's educated in Constantinople, in Athens, and then goes to Germany. He marries to a German lady of Scottish descent when a lot of Scottish people left Scotland in the beginning of the 18th century and went to various places, including Germany. And then they came back to Greece, where he became a school teacher in the 1850s. So he was a philologist, really. I mean, the main training is as a classics teacher. So he came back to Greece, eventually becoming a university professor on literature in the University of Athens. But then, as things were changing and he had an antiquarian interest, becoming the first university professor of archaeology in Greece. So Rossopoulos is really a fundamental figure for how Greek archaeology is being shaped at the time. And of course, he's fundamental not because he's the first professor, but because he's behind the foundation of the National Museum in Athens. Greek style, it started in the 1860s and it was completed a few decades later. Nevertheless, he was a pioneering figure with other colleagues from learned societies. And of course, he also excavated in the Keramaikos, bringing to light some amazing funerary monuments that you can see on display, both in the National Museum now and also in the museum that they have at the site of the Keramaikos. This is the most notable funerary ground of ancient Athens. What is interesting about Rossopoulos is that he wasn't just excavating, he was also collecting all sorts of things. And really, his collection is being praised as the best in Greece, probably better than the National Museum because it didn't open until the end of the 1880s. And you can see here, I mean, this is material in various museums that we have information about. I mean, there is a lot more that we cannot precisely ascertain that they come from Rossopoulos, but he's interested in everything. I mean, from stone tools to metal figurines, clay figurines, then to vases of some of them, you know, beautifully painted red figure, black figure vases, geometric material, coins, gems, kouros, you know, you mentioned it. And we are very lucky because we have the description actually of someone who visited his house. This is Alexander Freiherr von Warsberg, who in 1892 he publishes, we think the visit happened in the 1880s, that it is beyond description what I saw there in 5 narrow and low rooms crowded with art objects in such abundance that the owner himself can hardly move anymore therein. Here in this house, one can indeed have an overview and assess the entire range and value of the Greek arts and crafts. Now, is this usual? Is this unusual? You know, he's an archaeologist, he's collecting, he's not doing anything weird, but you will see that in the course of these decades, 1870s, 1880s, people, his colleagues, various institutions, visitors to Greece, they start wondering what the professor of archaeology is doing. So there is this ethical change, if you like, in the course of that period. And this is, I think, just to mention very briefly that obviously Warsberg left with a few objects because, again, we have the label that says, you know, bought from Rossopoulos. So not only he visited and described the house, he also got a few gifts or at least purchases. And we have a description from a British traveler. He was going to India, you know, Greece was en route. So a lot of people were stopping for that reason, not only for the antiquities. And there is a beautiful description there of someone who expresses his frustration, I think. And this is from 1880 when it was published. And this is a view of Athens around that time when Athens had a population, believe it or not, of 50,000 people. So a very small place by comparison to what it is today. But still greater astonishment resulted from an inspection by invitation of the splendid private collection of the archaeological professor in the university. After most courteously displaying his treasures, he let fall some remark that caused considerable surprise and led to certain questions, which elicited the fact that every object had its price. We sighed and thought of Athens as a place where all things are for sale, the city itself, if it could find the purchasers. So, and you will see there are more stories, of course, and I will share some of them for you tonight. There are concerns, there is growing awareness that the two, being a university professor in archaeology, conducting excavations, collecting antiquities and selling them, are not compatible. And Rossopoulos sold a lot of objects to France, to the Louvre, to museums in Berlin and Munich, to the British Museum. A lot of material after his death actually ended up in the US. And just to give you a glimpse of that and how lucrative the business could become for the Greek professor, he sold this Tanagra figurine, 4 of them actually, and you see one of them on the slide, for £760 back then in 1884. And that amount represents 40 times his monthly salary as a university professor in Greece. Now, these are 4 sales. My calculation is that he must have sold over 12,000 objects. So, you know, he had a huge house in Athens with his wife. They had 12 kids. The family is illustrious, actually, and it's not about the family. The family continued, and they're very influential to this day. But he had a huge house in the city center of Athens to accommodate his ever-growing family. And his power was immense. And you will see how he fits in this picture of the Antiquities trade. Now, when he came to the attention of the authorities that something was really wrong about Rossopoulos was in the case of this small perfume, this unguent bottle, an aribalos, as we call it, of the 7th, early 6th century BC, that Rossopoulos had previously published in the German Institute, the Journal of the German Institute in Rome. I think already this is very interesting because he publishes it in Rome. I mean, this is a Greek object from Greece. And then the authorities are aware of this publication. There were very few journals back then. And then suddenly it appears in London, in the British Museum. And Rossopoulos is trying to justify the situation. The situation gets out of hand, and there is a lot of publicity in the Greek press. And when I checked the diaries of the Greek superintendent of Antiquities, who is, I think, one of the heroes of the time, and he's hardly ever known. His name is Panagiotis Evstratiadis. He writes in relation to the Eneta Aribalos, Atanasius Rossopoulos, university professor, Antiquities Luther. Now, this is a record, you know, if you like, probably it's a record to me, because nobody did anything. And Evstratiadis notified the authorities. Nothing really happened. And Rossopoulos took the whole issue to the newspapers. And he said, in order to justify his actions, without the exchange and sale of unworthy and unnecessary objects, it is impossible to form an archaeological or any other collection for that matter. This practice is the common ethos of museums and collectors. So he's just following the trend. And even if Evstratiadis, the general superintendent, makes an alliance with the devil, he will not prove me wrong. The thing I have omitted here, but I will share it with you, is that at the end of the letter, he says, following Pindar, that I have many more arrows in my quiver. I don't know, I mean, did he have a plan to kill? I don't know, I mean, it sounds excessive. But clearly, you know, there is threat here. And someone who is in a different position. So you have power relations that, you know, they're not equal. And of course, the other thing that Rossopoulos said that I think really made Evstratiadis angry was that, you know, this is a small pot, very common. It's not that common because it has an inscription. So, you know, that I only sold, you know, out of my possessions. I have thousands of objects, as you know, he said to Evstratiadis, for 30 drachmas. Well, the problem is that he didn't sell it for 30 drachmas. I mean, he sold it for 1,000 drachmas. He sold it to Merlin, and then Merlin sent it to the British Museum. And of course, the British Museum published it in the new acquisition. So that's how the Greek authorities knew that, you know, okay, this is the Aineta Aribalos that Rossopoulos has already published. And in the article, he says, it's in my possession. So, you know, how did it end up in the British Museum? Everybody declared ignorance. And from then on, a lot of the activity of Rossopoulos went really underground and unnoticed by the authorities. They were still very suspicious of what he was doing. And I think the equivalent of the Society of Antiquaries in Greece, which was established in the 1830s, is the Athens Archaeological Society. And Rossopoulos was, of course, a very important member. And politely, they removed him from the books in the 1880s. Without publicizing the reason, there was Another reason why he was discharged from his duties in the university, supposedly because he had an affair with a lady in Italy and he promised to marry her. Again, that was widely publicized in the Greek press. But I think the main reason was that by the 1880s, the middle of the 1880s, these two were no longer compatible. He could not be excused, and a university professor teaching archaeology, conducting archaeology, could not be a dealer in antiquities. So again, I present that from the local perspective, but also to see the changing ethos in the course of these decades, because it's not like it was stable from the very beginning. And of course, this brings me to the second protagonist, and I must here dearly thank Leslie Fitton and Thomas Kiley and the British Museum for giving me access to this amazing resource. Charles Merlin is an amazing individual. He was the child of French expats, and he was born in London. And he didn't have any proper formal training. He became a clerk for the Foreign Office. And eventually, you know, when you have the restructuring of the Foreign Office, he started occupying a more consular position. And I think Lucia, who is in the audience, he has published this excellent book on the British Consular Service in the Aegean and the collection of antiquities for the British Museum. And you can see there the transformation of the service from something that, you know, was semi-professional to something that by the middle of the 19th century was a lot more professional. And I think Merlin, being Her Majesty's consul in the Piraeus, the port of Athens, he really took this advice, the instructions to the consuls abroad in reference to the acquisition of antiquities for the British Museum at heart. And he really wanted to deliver back to Newton and to the British Museum at the time. And of course, there is an amazing correspondence. We're talking about 220 letters, more than 50, 60,000 words of transcribed text that give us a unique insight in the operation of a dealer for a major museum. And I have access to a similar recording in the Louvre. The representative there was Olivier Ayet, and I have a similar character in Berlin. His name is Gustav Hirschfeld, and Hirschfeld will appear later on. There is another character in Denmark. His name is Blinkenberg. So, you know, it's not like Merlin was the only one operating in the country. I mean, a lot of interest from many different countries, and the records are there. And again, I would like you to bear in mind this transformation, this mentality, okay, that is really changing in that period. And Merlin, he may have been a little known figure, you know, back in England, or I think within the British Museum, he was well known because he was providing a lot of antiquities. But in Greece, he became a really important figure, because through his connections with the Foreign Office and the Consular Service, he was appointed, and this is a key appointment, from 1865 until his retirement in the late 1880s, as Inspector General, that is director, of the Ionian Bank on Corfu. And the Ionian Bank was set up when the Ionian Islands were part of the British Empire. And there is an excellent book by the late Philip Cottrell, with whom I corresponded, and he was really very generous until the end of his life. And he published this excellent book on the Ionian Bank, an imperial institution covering the 30 years until Merlin's transformation. And then there is a second volume, really, covering also Merlin's period of directorship. In case you don't know, you may well not know, the Ionian Bank was responsible, and Merlin himself was responsible, for the repayment of the loans that the British government gave to the Greek government during the War of Independence. The loans, you may know, were not well spent, but that's a different story. Merlin every year was, you know, like a bank, carefully saying to the Greek government, you still owe us this amount. He was very well established. I mean, he knows, of course, everybody else in the other embassies, but also the Greek politicians. And, you know, he describes to Newton when he's invited to Schliemann for a party, what Schliemann is doing in the Ilion Melathron. This is his grand house in the center of Athens. So he's very well established within Athenian society. And as I said, Athens being only 40, 50,000 people at the time. And here is just, you know, a graph showing in red the number of letters that he's sending to the British Museum, and then the antiquities sold. I mean, he sold a lot more early on than later on in his life. He has a very interesting approach. I mean, I think Leslie may agree or disagree. Newton becomes progressively all the more suspicious of Merlin because he's also sending some objects that are really dubious. I mean, they end up being forgeries. He's also really pussy. I mean, he wants his antiquities to be bought by the British Museum. And the way he operates is very interesting. And this is similar to how other agents of big museums are operating. He invests a little bit of money on the antiquities. He's trying to make a profit so that he can then buy more antiquities. And I think, you know, he's not really doing it. You will see I have a slide. I don't think he's doing it like Rossopoulos to make money. I mean, Rossopoulos is really aggressive. Rossopoulos is a huge player, earning a lot of money from that business. Merlin, I think he's in the boys club. I mean, he's part of this group, he interacts, he has connections, he likes and he loves these connections. Probably it's very good for the bank, to be honest. And on the side, he's making a little profit, but a lot of this profit is being reinvested for more antiquities, okay, for the British Museum. And here you see a small selection. I mean, the Aphrodite, the Venus that you see there, and that satyr stand, these are two of the most expensive sales from Merlin to the British Museum. His language is amazing. I mean, my favorite letter is probably, I didn't even know that that existed back then. He writes to Newton on the 14th of February, 1865. He says, "Dear Newton, this is not a Valentine. I'm still waiting for my money." So, you know, I was really surprised about the Valentine's joke, but he was not joking. And he was really insisting because the British Museum sometimes would take a lot of months or years to process something. And he says, "I'm collecting some very fine vases for you. I shall send them home as soon as they come out from the tombs, fresh from the grave." And that's one example that you can see in the British Museum. I give an equivalent. I mean, obviously the equivalents, use them with a pinch of salt. But the British Museum would spend regularly between 500 to 1,500, you know, on Merlin's purchases, but they would be very skeptical on something more expensive that he would send them from Athens. And to contextualize that, from his sales that we can document and we know, he made around £4,500. That is roughly the equivalent of what you see on the screen, but as I said, use it cautiously. His combined salary, that is from the consulate and from the bank, yielded £1,000 annually. So he was really extremely well paid. It's not that he was a poor man after 1865. And that is 6 times higher than Rossopoulos' salary and twice the amount of the director of the Bank of Greece. So, you know, just to put it in perspective, I mean, he was earning a lot of money only by his salary. And in the 20-something years he was operating with the British Museum, you know, he didn't make an exorbitant amount of money. And the objects he sold there, about 500 by comparison to the, say, 12,000, probably more, that Rossopoulos sold to various museums. So different scales, different operations, different interests, I think, and different agendas. And again, for comparison, this marble spinario was sold, this is the Castellani collection, and it was sold to the British Museum. This is, again, exceptional purchase because the British Museum felt this is a very important object to have in the collection. They paid £4,000 for one object. So again, just to see the comparison there. But the language he's using is amazing. I mean, it's fascinating. It's farming antiquities. I mean, that's what they're doing. And he says to Merlin, to Newton, excuse me, the keeper of the Greek and Roman department in the British Museum, owing to the little rain we have had this year and the dryness of the ground, only few antiquities have been discovered this winter, and I have seen nothing good. It's like an agricultural yield. You know, I'm afraid this year the yield was not good, dear Newton. And of course, you know, he would go there and inspect, he would befriend the local dealers, while Rossopoulos, you know, he was sitting on his desk giving orders. I have already given orders to all the tomb robbers of Attica and Athens who dig up old tombs all over Attica for the vases found in them, that whenever they find notable objects, they should bring them to me in exchange for a good price. And they do so. And there are, again, a lot of cases. I've published a few where you can see that in real action. And the best character, again, for today's presentation, from the diggers, from the people who are called harvesters or earth contractors of antiquities, is Ioannis Palaiologos, one of the most prolific private diggers of 19th century Greece, who, to be honest, I would call him an archaeologist. I mean, he is the person who is digging. If you think Merlin is digging, he's not, he's collecting. If you think Rossopoulos was digging, well, no, he had Palaiologos who was doing the work for him, because Palaiologos was the worker that worked with Rossopoulos in the Keramaikos excavations. Okay, so it's And Thomas Kiley has written about that also on Cyprus. You know, you have these people who, they are in a gray zone. They are good guys and bad guys, and you can't classify them. And they are selling antiquities, but then, as you will see, they notify the authorities. And they're very experienced diggers. I mean, they know what they're doing, a lot more than the academic archaeologists of the time. And they excavated with Rossopoulos and other workers, of course, the Keramaikos, and they found, of course, on the left, you see a very famous funerary stele that is now in Athens. And on the right, you see a beautiful red figure fragment with the statue of Harmodios and Aristogiton, the Tyrannicides, who is now in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston from Rossopoulos' excavations in the 1860s. So some of the things he was keeping for sale, a lot of the things, it has to be said, especially the much bigger spectacular pieces, he gave to the museum in Athens. But something that you may not know is that Palaiologos is actually behind some of the most astonishing discoveries in Greece. So in any Greek handbook, you will see some of these objects. So it was Palaiologos that found the Cycladic figurines that you see here. It was Palaiologos that found the Dipylon Ainokoe. It was Palaiologos that excavated some of the most astonishing geometric vases, because the vases didn't come from the Keramaikos, but from Platia Koumoundourou. Platia Koumoundourou is the next square to the Keramaikos. But you know, if you go nowadays, you're not going even to spend a minute there. So I'm afraid that's where the main ground for the geometric finds of Palaiologos that now adorn the collection in Athens and other collections across Europe came from, not the classical later Keramaikos. And sorry about this is just an inconsistency because of the systems here, but Olivier Rayet that I mentioned for the Louvre, he says that he's un des chercheurs d'antiques le plus expérimenté d'Athènes. He's the most experienced archaeologist, really, of Athens. Go to Palaiologos. He knows what he's doing. And this is an interesting story with Efstratiadis, the general superintendent, because in the records of the Archaeological Service, Efstratiadis records that he arrests Palaiologos for digging illicitly in an area of Athens called Menidi, and he's fined. And Palaiologos, of course, you know, pays the fine, okay? 2 days later, Efstratiadis records that thanks to Mr. Palaiologos, we have been alerted to the discovery of a major tomb. And this is the intact Mycenaean Menidi Tholos tomb, which is a spectacle. I mean, you can see a modern photo there, you can visit. It's an archaeological site. And of course, it was intact and it had offerings also in the dromos, in the passageway from the archaic period. So it's a spectacular context. So clearly he was trying to be good and bad. You know, he was trying to get away as much as he could, but at the same time, the authorities really relied on these people because, you may not be surprised to hear that, Efstratiadis, until the 1870s, was working on his own for the Kingdom of Greece. That is one archaeologist for the entire kingdom. That's why I have to say, I admire the guy. I mean, you read the notebooks, they're very well organized. He's a very clever man, well educated as well in Athens and then Germany as it was common at the time, but nobody seems to listen what Efstratiadis has to say. I mean, he's completely alone. So this puts archaeology also in perspective, and I will come back to this a little bit because clearly in the mouths of politicians, antiquity is a huge capital. In reality, that doesn't really work. And of course, there were colleagues of Rossopoulos who progressively started to realize, look, what he's doing is really bizarre. And this is Stefanos Koumanoudis, who was the president, like Martin now is, of the Society of Antiquaries. He was the president of the Athens Archaeological Society and Latin professor at the University of Athens. He's also a founding father of the study of inscriptions in Greece. And he says, doing the right thing, I'm not mad about the antiques as Rossopoulos is, although I'm a more genuine friend of the arts, so he says archeophilos, than many of those who have developed an antikomani. So there are the archeophili, the friends of, and the archeomanis, those who are maniac about antiquities, you know, mad about antiquities. And you know, this is very sketchy, obviously, but I would say that Rossopoulos represents, you know, the connoisseur, international cosmopolitan collector who thinks that the sale of antiquities should be, of course, allowed. Only by selling and exchanging objects can one build a collection, and Greek antiquities abroad, this comes also from his writings, should be seen as ambassadors of Greece, representing the country. So this is a great thing. On the other hand, Koumanoudis can be described as an archaeologist, but, again, happy to discuss all these terms. I mean, they're not set in stone. He seems to express more what we would call as cultural nationalism. Everything belongs to us, so we shouldn't share these things. The sale of antiquities is a disgraceful act for him. Antiquities should be recorded and stored in national museums, and Greek antiquities are the reason that Greece is being respected and envied for. This is something, again, it's a topos. It's something that the Greek authorities are trying to embed to the locals as well, because they try to say, guys, these are your ancestors. However, that's why the foreigners would like to take them away from you, because it's your national pride. So they're, it's a technique. I mean, they're trying to convince the local population as well why these things are important, other than, as we know all too well, for scientific reasons. I mean, it's not, that goes beyond saying, but they were trying to convince the populace. And I think the most traumatic experience was really the exit of the Tanagra figurines. As far as I can tell, and I'm happy to get feedback from others, in the 1870s, there is the looting, documented looting of thousands of tombs in Boeotia. The authorities tried to intervene. I think this is the reason why a second archaeologist is eventually appointed. This is Stamatakis, who will work with Schliemann. Not a good relationship there in the excavations at Mycenae. Again, he died very young. I mean, these people, unfortunately, their career stopped too early, and they were great archaeologists. But again, how can you control that? And there is another reason that, happy to elaborate further. In Greece, we still don't have a fully clear cadastral map. Unlike the Ordnance Survey of the United Kingdom, Great Britain, we don't. And the mess was bigger in the 19th century as to what was private land and what was public land, what was state land and what was owned. And in Tanagra, what happened is that a lot of people bought land, including foreigners, for private contractors, extractors of the earth and harvesters, to get antiquities, and you will see what the law allowed them to do with them, okay? But the Greek newspaper in the 1870s and 1880s, I mean, they now criticize extensively what is going on. There are poems making fun of the authorities. There are cartoons, they will take everything if we allow them to do that. And this is something that is clearly, again, representing the change, I think, in mentality in that particular period. And this brings me to the last part of my talk, which is, the elephant in the room, the law. There were clearly discussions and debates early on and during the work of the War of Independence as to what an archaeological law for the protection of antiquities should say and do, especially the language that should be used and how punitive it would be to offenders. Perhaps more importantly, there was discussion about ownership. Should the state be the single, exclusive owner of all antiquities, or should the past somehow be shared? Needless to say that antiquities were recognized very early on by Greek Enlightenment writers like Adamantios Korais, and later by state authorities as a capital of the greatest importance and a major resource, not only for the pride of the nation, but also politically and economically so. Allow me very briefly to compare an early case of debate and of different thinking on this topic. Take, for example, Mustoxidis, Andreas Mustoxidis, and Kapodistrias. These people are part of the first government of Greece. This is before Otto, before the Bavarians. And what Mustoxidis says in this draft decree to form a new archaeological legislation in the newly formed state of Greece, it's not yet a kingdom, because the ancient remains of liberal arts reside in this very place, the patrimonial land, where they were made and for this reason shine all the more brightly, and because their preservation and conservation of those things that have escaped the damage of time and the impact of barbarians bestow pride to the nation and are useful for the study of all those things that are good, for these reasons, we vote the following. And he seems to, these are very well-educated men who come from the Ionian Islands, and there are excellent studies now talking about this period of transnationalism because, it's not very clear where they belong. So they were born when the Ionian Islands were controlled by Britain, sorry. Then you have an Ottoman control of the islands. Then you have a Russian control of the islands. And of course, during this Russian period, Kapodistrias will become the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Tsar. So, they are very proud, I think, to be Greeks. There is no doubt about that. But they have a lot of allegiances. And it's not as clear-cut as we want to present it, certainly until the 1850s. I think after 1850s, the situation changes. And they were educated in Italy. Again, there are these two streams, either Germany or Italy. And Mustoxidis was also a famous poet. And he seems to base his decree on what he knows is the latest legislation. And that comes from Italy, from the Papal States. This is the Papal Edict of Cardinal Pacca of 1820. And they're very strict. And the control appears to come more and more under the state authorities. Not so much sharing and not so much freedom. And this appears to echo well with Capodistrias, the first governor of Greece, who was eventually assassinated, so that stops short, and then you have the Bavarian rule. But Capodistrias, finally, when he introduces a legislation, a sort of legislation, it's a circular, in 1830, he sends it to the local officials and says that everything is going to be under the state control, and that went against the financial interests, of course, of private owners of antiquities. It made the job of local functionaries almost impossible, as they lacked the personnel to monitor the enforcement of the law and people's compliance to it, and that continued, as we saw, for most of the 19th century. And the language of the law did not appeal to or express the majority of the population. So it was very strict, very punitive, everything's under. But they had a very clear idea, that's what we're going to do. And this is very interesting. I have discussed these early efforts in more length in a paper that I published recently, the details of which you can see on the slide in case you want to find out more about the topic. But it suffices to say here that complete state ownership was not really exercised by the state in Greece until almost after a century the country gained its independence from the Ottoman Empire. Soon after Greece became an independent nation in 1830, it was the legislation introduced in 1834 by the Bavarians, who would go on to rule Greece for the first 30 years of the country's existence, that set the tone for the trade in antiquities. And in my paper, I have argued that the Bavarian antiquities law that lasted until the end of the century, and therefore covers entirely the period I'm investigating, should be understood from our perspective as a crypto-colonial contraption. And in doing so, I follow here the concept of crypto-colonialism developed by the anthropologist Michael Herzfeld. I say crypto-colonial because, in my view at least, the law transformed Greece into a marketplace for European antiquities dealers. Moreover, and despite the law's national rhetoric, and you can see here, all antiquities within Greece being works of the ancestors of the Greek people shall be regarded national property of all Greeks in general. So despite the national rhetoric and progressive embeddedness of antiquity in the national consciousness, the actual nationalization of antiquities was only partially successful in the 19th century, with that particular law allowing, under certain but very wide conditions, the private possession of antiquities, shared ownership between state and private landholders, the free and legal trade in ancient objects, even allowing for the highest bidder to outbid the state itself at auction. And while it prohibited, allegedly, the export of antiquities altogether, in reality, a committee of 3 specialists could be appointed to evaluate and accordingly decide whether the antiquities were fit for export, being, and I record based on the law, duplicates or useless and worthless for the Greek museums. In this respect, and in opposition to the early efforts by Mustoxidis and Capodistrias, the 1834 law of Maurer and Weissenburg, both with extensive experience of the legislation in the Papal States with regard to antiquities, were closer in language and character to earlier Vatican legislation. This is the Edict Valenti Gonzaga in particular of 1750, which, at that time, yes, was introducing measures to protect the export of antiquities from Rome, but that was like 80 years ago, and it was superseded by other legislation than the stricter laws by Carlo Fea and Bartolomeo Pacca that provided the inspiration, as I've mentioned already, to Mustoxidis. So clearly, there is a very interesting selection there and why they're doing it, okay? And by crypto-colonial, I mean, Greece was never exactly a colony, but actually the law serviced more the international market than the Greeks themselves. Now, to say that this is a period of political instability for Greece is not enough to explain the situation. Greece changed 54 governments between 1857 and 1898. Well, look at Italy. There wasn't even, first of all, there wasn't an Italy as such, but political chaos prevailed in Europe. So, it's not like Greece was exceptional here. But I think this is important because it's easy to say, okay, the Greek government, who was on the Greek government, but I think it's an excuse. The authorities responsible for the safeguarding of antiquities, of course, as mentioned many times, they lacked personnel and financial means, but they were very well aware of the illegal activities. And unfortunately, they were unable to intervene. And you will see here a very interesting case. This is Gustav Hirschfeld operating for the Berlin Museum. And Efstratiadis makes a note and he says he came back to Greece from Germany with the same, of course, order by his government to buy something and export it without my authorization. You will not be surprised, nothing happened, nothing happens. So equally, Peter Alexandrovich Saburov, he was the Russian ambassador to Greece, and within 10 years, he amassed a collection of antiquities, and this is very interesting, right? He gets antiquities to make money. So this is not for the advancement of knowledge, this is something entirely new, it's commodification of the past, I buy, I sell, I make money. Efstratiadis was very well aware, he is writing reports, he says, we should prevent Saburov from creating a collection because he will eventually send it away. He sent it away. So and you may think, okay, but really nobody was doing anything? Well, Ioannis Voronos, famous numismatist in Greece, like Efstratiadis, was falsely accused by people higher up of thefts. And they were removed from their position, disgracefully so. And I think by the 1890s, when Rossopoulos was finally very old, he had enough. And he published privately, really printed, a little booklet that I think everybody should read. It's called Light on Archaeological Scandals. He had enough. I mean, he gives names. He says who the dealers are, who the professors are. You're not going to be surprised. Rossopoulos is one of them. So he's a member of the committee who says this is worthless and useless and must be exported. So clearly the system is entirely flawed, and it was flawed for 65 years. And the inability of the government to introduce a new legislation. At some point we hear that unfortunately the parliament closed for the summer, and for this reason there was no time to introduce the new legislation, and then they forgot it when autumn came. And even Edward Capps, he was a professor of Greek language at the University of Chicago at the time. Then he became a trustee of the American School of Classical Studies in Athens. He says that the illicit trafficking of antiquities has long been known to the authorities at Athens, but they profess to be unable under the present law to check the traffic. I have heard responsible persons in Athens even express the belief that persons high in authority connive at it. However this may be, the business of collecting and exporting antiquities has become so extensive and is so openly conducted that ignorance or indifference on the part of the government is no longer possible. And, I mean, that was openly done, okay? So it is also necessary, this is Mare's Handbook to Travelers to Greece, to remind interesting purchasers that the law exists prohibiting the removal of all objects of antiquity, however insignificant. But there is a note in small print. Mr. Rossopoulos, professor of archaeology in the University of Athens, has an interesting collection of vases. Although the more important specimens are seldom for sale, he also has a number of miscellaneous antiquities to dispose of. His charges are moderate, and the traveler may have the satisfaction of knowing that anything purchased is undoubtedly genuine. Well, that's not true. So the new legislation, eventually introduced in 1899, removed a number of the problematic elements of the Bufferian law. However, I would argue that the extensive looting of antiquities, the publicization, especially from the 1870s in the press, of articles scorning politicians about the situation, the lucrative economic side of the business, and an increased and expanded national rhetoric, which coincided across Europe with a tendency at the time towards nation-focused history writing, changed significantly the attitudes that local population had with the past and its physical manifestation. So for the first time, we see public reaction. Okay? Before, there was very little or none, irrespective of what the authorities were saying. And you see here how they tried to nationalize this situation. For example, this is advice given to functionaries across Greece that we Hellenes owe our independence to a large extent to the glorious name and the immortal monuments of art which we have inherited from our ancient ancestors. And you can see here some similarities with what Koumanoudis was trying to do. Move them, of course, say, guys, realize this is important because these are our ancestors and it's sacrilege what is happening. And of course, we need to safeguard that if we wish to prove to the civilized world that it was justified that we became an independent state and that justify also that we are called Hellenes, okay? And this change, in my view, is extremely significant. It is not to say that before certain groups and circles were not promoting this cause, but to emphasize that now, for the first time, and more systematically, the population of Greece on a far wider scale started to become aware of the many dimensions of the Antiquities trade, the remarkable departures from past attitudes and practices. And I hope that you agree with the quote by Professor Fotiadis, that we are likely to forget that those laws, whether it was the Mustoxidis Capodistrias or whether it was the legislation by the Bavarians, are human institutions. They're products of history, and treat them instead as if they draw their authority from a timeless universal sense of right or wrong. Our relationship with antiquities is now mediated by a quasi-naturalized legal framework. So in the last 45 minutes or so, I have tried to introduce you to my work and share with you some thoughts and findings. Clearly, it is very difficult to do full justice in such a short period on this multifaceted topic that, of course, extends beyond the boundaries of Greece. It's not like, as I said many times, Greece is an exceptional case here, and which today, of course, is at the heart of numerous discussions regarding ownership and repatriation. However, I hope to have shown why it is important to study the social dimension of this topic and why we must give equal balance to objects and people. Like archaeology as a whole, I think the study of this topic is both about the distant past as well as about the recent one, and of course about the present and the future. How we have excavated, collected, and displayed the past and continue to do so clearly affects our narratives. That is how we think about the past in the present, what we want the past to do for us, and ultimately framing, reframing, shaping, reshaping our relationship with it. What practical knowledge, may one ask, emerges from this exploration? The list is long, and I hope you agree that some answers to this question have already been provided. But for the sake of clarity, and to finish my talk, I'd like to summarize the key points. We now have a much better, clearer, factual understanding of the organization of the trade in Greece. And this is a very rough schema that you see on the slide. A more complex one is under preparation for a publication I need to submit. And we can contextualize objects that were previously decontextualized. We can also trace the development of archaeology in that part of the Mediterranean from the research questions that are changing over time to excavation methods that are developing, and of course the many roles objects fulfilled in the societies of the 19th century. We can also follow closely the development of terminology. This is nomenclature, archaeological nomenclature, but also the terminology in the legal documents. How do they describe things? What do they group under certain categories? What is an ancient object? And to trace, of course, the extent of fakes and forgeries, which already from the 1860s and 70s were becoming a real problem. And if this already is not enough, a study of the trade extends our knowledge of how archaeological assemblages were perceived and were meant to be used. Assemblages, which, as I have tried to show in a number of publications, need to be treated either with extreme caution or largely be disregarded, as in a number of instances, they appear to constitute fabrications in a dealer's workshops to satisfy the ever-growing need of archaeologists for groups to allow them to develop further their typologies and chronologies. So for example, Arthur Evans goes to Athens, he goes to Palaiologos, and he wants a group because he wants to synchronize chronologies. And Palaiologos creates something for him, for Amorgos in the 3rd millennium, and of course, you want something Mycenaean, I will give you something Mycenaean, no problem. Here is also a plan. Now, are we to trust it? We can use it and think with it, but unfortunately, we have no other knowledge other than this archival documentation. Perhaps most important of all are the cultural heritage debates that existed at the time, and to have shared with you, the voices of the local actors. Now, having done that, of course, I need to recognize that this is an all-white, all-male lineup, which, of course, is how much the situation is reflected at the time, but it is also a problem, as well as to present and share with you the legal framework within which these people operated. What emerges, this is the easy answer, is of course a lot more complexity, but instead of sidelining the work of these people, illicit and licit, we must, in my view, reintroduce the private archaeology, as I call it, and again, happy to discuss the term, to the narratives of Greece's exploration, archaeological exploration. In the actions of these private earth contractors and the official and unofficial reactions that followed, we often find archaeological thinking taking shape, practices being rethought of, also with regards to the protection of antiquities, and ultimately archaeological and historical interpretation emerging. After all these operations, the private operations, for the most part in the course of the 19th century, represented the core of archaeological activity in Greece. Putting them aside is like ignoring what came before the advent of systematic archaeological exploration. To achieve this goal, a closer collaboration between shareholders is necessary if we are to promote further the untapped knowledge that can come out of the study of archives and objects in particular with regards to studying the people of the antiquities trade, their thinking and actions. And I'm currently putting a project together to map, to the extent possible, all these activities, whether we trust them or not, for the period I'm investigating, with the hope that it becomes an indispensable tool on better understanding the extent of these operations, but also the progress of systematic exploration in the Aegean, because often systematic exploration followed the looting. A very good example is the Cyclades. I mean, Chuntas comes 20 years after Paleologos has rifled all the cemeteries there. So, it's very important to see where they go, what they do, and how that maps out in relation to the systematic archaeological exploration. And I'm aiming to develop, of course, hopefully further synergies with colleagues around the Mediterranean for a deeper and wider understanding of what is undoubtedly a much broader, complex social phenomenon than currently recognized by the majority of scholars. Finally, something I didn't have the time to talk about, which, however, is incredibly important in my view, is that any heritage legislation should not be about any one period or a particular cultural aspect, as for a very long time was the case in Greece. I mean, now it's not, but it used to be the case. It should be inclusive and effective in dealing with our multiple pasts and the multiple and diverse levels of human creativity. After all, that is what archaeologists and heritage specialists are always confronted with, multiple lives and complex histories. The multiple layers that we encounter in the history of any modern state should be sources of inspiration, reflection, and pride for all. They offer insights into the diverse human history of which we are part. It is for these reasons that we must protect them, and it is for these reasons that we must move past heritage legislations embedded in 19th and early 20th century nationalistic rhetorics towards measures that appeal to more people, are up to date with the ethical concerns of the 21st century, and help restart a dialogue with regards to the complex relationship of law, heritage, and conservation. And it is also for these reasons that I believe that it is important to have a proper and honest discussion on the social histories surrounding the antiquities trade. After all, we should not forget that any measures introduced while directed to safeguarding and promoting tangible and intangible cultural heritage are thought by people, for people. They are informed by contemporary concerns and ultimately have significant impact on our attitudes and dispositions towards the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Yanis. That was a splendid exposition, which opens up a whole series of different aspects of the subject. I'm going to open the floor to questions in a moment. We've got people online as well as in the room. So what I'll do is ask, if you want to ask a question, if you can raise your hand. Rebecca will come to you with the mic, and if you can identify yourself before asking the question. Before I open it to the floor, can I just take the chair's privilege? With the British connection and Merlin, how far do you think that was directed from the British Museum end? And to what extent was it just his initiative?
I will give my answer, and I think we have people from the British Museum, and of course, Lucia, I think, is here in the audience too. It's like, my impression is that the British Museum is certainly interested. Merlin comes across as over-enthusiastic, an over-enthusiastic provider. I think at the beginning, they're all the more interested because of the discoveries happening in Greece in the 1860s. Don't forget the Keramaikos, and of course, there are excavations in Phaleron. So clearly, Newton, who is an excellent scholar of the time, he doesn't want to miss what is going on in the archaeological scene of Greece. But I think progressively, they are less and less interested in Merlin. And Merlin is always trying to excite them with great news and gossip. I mean, gossip is, and then, so I think it's not really that Newton is frequently giving him advice as to what to purchase. This is actually rare. It's Merlin who takes the initiative, and he's doing that. And that's why I said that to some extent, my suspicion is that he's also doing it for his own reasons that are not exactly financial. I mean, for Rossopoulos, it seems financial, really. For Merlin, I think, because of his position, and he's really worried because of his position. I mean, he writes to Newton and he says, my name should never appear ever again in the new acquisitions of the British Museum because, you know, I mean, he's under threat and he's trying to build this relationship with the Greek authorities. So it's difficult. But I think, yes, you're right there, Martin. I mean, it's not like he gets from Newton instructions to buy whatever. We need to be very careful that that's not what is happening. And that's not how they operated anyway. And again, Merlin is relatively old. All the other people I mentioned, Blinkenberg and Hirschfeld and Rayet, I mean, they're young and up and coming archaeologists of that thing, and they're trying to satisfy really the masters back in Paris or Berlin. So Merlin is a different kind of person. But he clearly uses and abuses the diplomatic power. I mean, he's sending stuff. This is clear with the gunboat back to Liverpool. So clearly, this is how a lot of antiquities are moving. But no, it's a lot of his own initiative, I would say. And of course, Leslie and Thomas and others may come into this. Yeah.
Leslie, I think you're entirely right. I think Newton is sitting in the British Museum. Things are shown to him by Merlin. I think it doesn't occur to him, it's just not the nature of it, that Newton himself would have any sort of shopping list.
No.
Not of sites or areas, never mind of specific objects or types of objects. So I think from his point of view, it's reactive. And Merlin, as you say, is like an adorable puppy dog, jumping up and down. And the correspondence between Newton and Merlin, I think, is really funny because Merlin is so humorous and teasy and gossipy, and Charles Newton will not enter into that. He is so formal and solemn in the way that he responds to him. It's fascinating stuff.
No,
thank you for a lovely lecture.
Thank you very much, Leslie, and also for all your help over so many years. I think the other thing I wanted to add in relation to a distinction between these people is that Rossopoulos, of course, because he has so much money, he's very mobile. I mean, for the middle of the 19th century, you find him in Paris, in Berlin, in London. I mean, it'd be easy. It's very easy for him to travel. Merlin does travel because his job, of course, requires it, and he is in London. And sometimes we know that he's talking to the British Museum, in person with the objects. But people like Palaiologos, so different scales, I mean, he never moves. And we have letters of Palaiologos. So, this is the other interesting thing. It's with Rossopoulos, you have a lot of information. With Merlin, a lot of information. When it comes to the actual diggers, as you can imagine, a lot less, and it's very difficult to read. But from their language that, Palaiologos is educated. I mean, he's not someone who didn't finish school. And for someone to have finished school in the middle of the 19th century, that's already an achievement in Greece in the middle. So I think, I wouldn't call him some kind of an antiquarian scholar, Palaiologos, not at all, and he didn't have the money to travel. But some of the other dealers eventually, 1870s, 1880s, following Rousseau, they would travel and they would talk locally to the authorities. I stay in that hotel. When can I come and see you?
Hello, yes, you mentioned at the end, it's a little bit strange when you said in this list, yes, they were all white and male. I have to raise a few queries about, not the white bit, but the male bit, because I am aware, my wife's Polish, and there's a lady collector, Izabela Kartoyinska, who's definitely a collector and probably procured things, she's Polish. There was Gertrude Bell, is just towards the end of this period, so I don't think she collected as well. You have, of course, a lot of famous women archaeologists. Thinking of, Kathleen Kenyon, of course, that's much later, and then you've got Agatha Christie. So a lot of female white people, admittedly.
You have a lot more female voices later on. So later on you find it. And I think what I need to mention here is that you do have female voices from travelogues, because usually they are doing the description of the journey. And through that, you get a lot of information about the interaction, say, their husbands had with the antiquities dealers. But again, I may be wrong here, but most of these transactions were happening between men. And I need to investigate that side of the story anyway further, because clearly there are ladies, but most of the material I have studied and had access to are these men. So I need to acknowledge the fact that I'm biased here because I'm highlighting these people instead of covering everybody. But I also have one life.
I know it's long, but Kartoyinska is interesting because she was collecting quite a lot of stuff.
Yeah,
a lot of it sadly got dispersed in the Second World War. And her husband wasn't as interested as she was. She actually put in place a castle where she could stick things
Yeah.
together.
I think for the 20th century, the story is different. And again, other colleagues here can correct me. It's not as easy to access archival material. It's a lot more sensitive, especially after the war. But I think the 19th century is a treasure trove already for proper systematic exploration, and we should learn from that. First, have a fundamental basis, and then I think the time will come, and eventually this material will be studied. But thank you very much for that. And of course, it is important. I take this seriously, that voices need to be represented.
Thank you. Very interesting. And thank you for your lecture.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Just putting aside the ethos of like the profiteering, how beneficial do you think it was, the movement of the antiquities or the objects, sorry, for like scholarly research around Europe?
So in a way, you mean the impact that the trade may have had scholarly, apart from the, no, I think, look, there is the side of the advancement of knowledge. And I think if someone was collecting like Rossopoulos on the basis of the advancement of knowledge, there would be little criticism, because of course there are a lot of Greek collectors at the time of Rossopoulos. Rossopoulos is the one that, has a lot of antiquities. I mean, he's overdoing it, he's extravagant. But there are many others. I mean, Rangavis is another person, Alexandros Rizos Rangavis, who has an extensive. So having it in Greece for the enjoyment of fellow antiquarians or for the advancement of knowledge, that wasn't criticized, because of course a lot of people had antiquities. What started to be criticized is really selling them, making money. Now, the impact these collections have on how the discipline progresses is immense. I mean, it is something that we need to acknowledge and not take lightly. It's not, that's why I think, a lot of what has been written, this is my personal view, on this matter is very sensational. And it's also, there are people who are really tied sentimentally, emotionally, nationally to these subjects. And perhaps I am too, to some extent. I mean, I feel sad for someone like Stratiadis. If I were in his shoes, why was he doing his job? Because he had a job, he knew what he had to do. He's writing to himself and to me and to others. Nobody does anything. So I think I feel sorry for him because of the role he has, but he was doing his job correctly. So for sure, there is advancement of knowledge, there is impact. People are learning out of these collections that end up in European museums, and that's great. At the same time, we need to acknowledge that, for someone like Rossopoulos, he was really a very dodgy figure. When you're meant to be teaching archaeology, you're meant to protecting antiquities, and you're making lucrative amounts on the side. So yeah, it's tricky. It's a very difficult topic because we need to acknowledge both sides without simply saying it's bad. Paleologos is also a favorite character of mine. He excavates to satisfy the doctor in Oxford, George Rolleston. He says, this time I went deeper because you told me to go to the earlier layers. And you were right, this is pre-Periclean. I mean, they also advanced the chronology because of the coins, he realized this is early. So, and Rolleston was very famous because he was in the big debate with Darwin. He was on the side of Darwin, and famously, he brought a monkey's skull out of his pocket and displayed it. So he had a huge collection of skulls of animals and humans, as people were doing back then. And Debbie has written on the subject of skulls, skeletons. But this is the thing. I mean, it's these people were also promoting through their work archaeology, and through their work, whether we criticize them or not, archaeology was taking shape. And I think not acknowledging the fact that they exist is really bizarre.
A question from our online audience. Would you say that the legal and institutional framework of the first decades of the Greek state was more or less restrictive than the previous Ottoman one from the 40-50 years before the creation of the Greek state when it comes to the extraction and commercialism of antiquities from Greece?
Well, I think, in terms of Ottoman legislation, the real proper Ottoman legislation is not introduced until much later. So, the Ottoman state does not have something akin to what the papal states have. But then again, you know, Spain is doing something, and I think that's why the work of Chiara Manoni is so important, just to get this comparative perspective. So there are other places, and you know, Spain is connected through Naples, of course. So they have Naples, they have Pompeii, and through that, the Bourbons are introducing, you know, the various royal families of Spain, they're introducing legislation inspired by Rome. I think Rome is the center, and there are lots of studies taking heritage legislation in Rome back to the 13th, 14th century. And you may know that Raphael, the famous Raphael, the painter, I mean, he's a curator of antiquities for the Vatican. That's his day job. So the thing is that nobody knew how to protect and conserve. I mean, this is a new thing. This is something that they are thinking more seriously from the 18th century, but only in the 19th century, especially with nation states, with the commercialization now skyrocketing, there is reaction. And of course, ultimately, there is reaction also in the Ottoman Empire. And, you know, the story there is, for me, again, rather sad, because they were very generous. I mean, they were giving half of the fines legally, and you have someone like Schliemann who took everything out of the country. So, yeah, you know, I mean, that doesn't stop surprising me. But I think to go back, yes, clearly there were measures when before there were no measures. So that's great. But the Bavarian framework, I always found very strange because it has all these excuses. Yes, they all belong to the state, but, and then you have all these articles explaining that actually you can get them out. And I don't know, I mean, for me, I think the fact that Otto is the son of Ludwig, and the fact that all these people interact with great collectors, there must be pressure there as to how best to frame the archaeological legislation of the country. So yes, the situation is better to have a legislation than not to have a legislation, but if the legislation is ineffective for 65 years, that's useless.
I'm going to stop the discussion in this room. We've got some drinks outside, so people can continue the discussion informally. Clearly, from the questions and the comments, extremely stimulating and fantastic talk. So can we thank Yanis again for that? I give notice that the next ordinary meeting will be on Thursday, the 9th of February at 5:15, when we'll hear a paper, Pastel Dolig and the Brin Spoons, a new investigation by Dr. Toby Driver, FSA, Professor Andrews Fitzpatrick, FSA. Meeting stands adjourned. Thank you very much.